enjoy any good love story as much as the next self-respecting female. I think as little girls, we're all kind of hardwired to love romance. It's why every little girl wanted to find her prince, every adolescent had infinite crushes on guys that were way out of our league, and every woman indulges in reading far too many romance novels with progressively wilder and wilder plots. I used to work in a bookstore, and it felt as if the romance section grew bigger and bigger the longer that I worked there. Between Book Talk advertising their favorite romances continuously, and the pandemic ensuring that all of us were reading and marketing reading materials more, well, it's easy to see where a lot of this nonsense has come from. Now, for the record, villains loving or even lusting after princesses or the main female character of a story is nothing new. It's been happening for ages and will likely continue to happen long after myself and the people watching this video are gone. It's the ultimate form of enemies to lovers, a trope that just satisfies a lot of baser instincts and makes a romance just that much sweeter by the end. However, there are several reasons as to why the villain and the main character falling in love are never really a good thing. And today I want to talk about why, because we are seeing more and more of these thirst trap villains as time has gone on, and the more I see, the more grossed out I become. Like I said earlier, villains desiring the princess is not a new concept. I can think of a few examples from Disney animated movies from the 90s to illustrate my point, namely the advisor Jafar and Count Frollo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Both were men much older than their desired love interests, and both had egos the size of the cities they were living in. Both were in positions of power, and both wanted more and enjoyed lording what influence they did have over others. In Jafar's case, while he did desire Jasmine, it had more to do with the power that her position as princess would give him in Agrabah. He was a member of the nobility, being the Sultan's advisor and all, but for him it wasn't enough. He wanted to be the Sultan and rule the city himself. So Jasmine represented an ideal that he was striving towards. It helped that she was beautiful and available, which would have made her even more tempting for someone like him. Put all that together and she was the ideal match for him in his mind, beyond any other woman who might have been around at the time. Jasmine, firecracker that she was though, was having none of it. She despised Jafar and everything he represented and fought against him tooth and nail, even though she was captured and Aladdin had been sent to the farthest reaches of the earth. In the end, she helped Aladdin take him down by using that same femininity that had tempted Jafar in the first place to distract him so Aladdin could do what he needed to do. Can you imagine if Jasmine had turned around and said, "You know what? I'm not interested in a street rat. I want the biggest, baddest baller around," and married Jafar, succumbing to his ideals, helping him do away with her father, Aladdin, and the genie in one fell swoop. And then they would have lived evilly ever after, with Iago the parrot narrating the wedding ceremony. Does anyone else realize how insane that sounds? A lot of 90s kids who loved the movie would have been appalled and cheated on Aladdin's behalf, because for the hero to do all this work, suffer as much as he did, and end up with nothing, would have been sacrilegious to us all. But for as nuts as all that sounds, I guarantee that somewhere out there is fan fiction about everything I have just said. Oh, and look, it's from a best-selling series, too. The story of Count Frollo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, however, is more interesting. While Jafar's regard for Jasmine is a bit more subtle, with the exception of that scene at the end, Frollo has an entire song dedicated to his desire for Esmeralda. I just want to quickly say that Hellfire is one of the greatest Disney songs ever made, if not the greatest. It's a villain ballad like no other because it gives such chilling insights into the villain's psyche. In it, Frollo demonstrates his piety, his narcissism, his disgust for others, but at the same time his struggles and his failure to call himself to account, blinded as he is by lust. Esmeralda represents something forbidden to him because of his own perceived righteousness and becomes the ultimate temptation for a man of his stature. He is willing to forsake all of his so-called morals as long as she is given to him forever. And he would feel perfectly justified in doing this because he feels she will be his reward. However, Frollo was also afraid at the start of the song of giving in to his desires, fearing what it will mean for his soul and unwilling to face accountability for his own failings. By the end of the song, though, he has gone through his own character arc where he seems to hold fast to his own perceived righteousness before falling into fear of himself and shifting the blame to finally deciding to hang it all and declaring that if he can't have Esmeralda, no one will. It's an utterly brilliant ballad that has a great deal of moral and spiritual undertones that I won't go into in this video. Let's just enjoy this last few seconds of the song. Now, for as nuanced and interesting as these two men were, there was one other very important thing that they had in common. They were both creeps. But the audience was smart enough to understand that they were creeps, so there was no ethical or moral ambiguity when inserting them into a story. Fast forward a decade and a half later, and we have shows like Gossip Girl and Pretty Little Liars where teen girls were hooking up with men twice their age while still in high school. For those of you who have watched the latter, please tell me that you were not fans of Arya and Mr. Fitz. He may not have been the villain of the show, but for the love of God, could someone save the naive 16-year-old from her high school English teacher? Even as a teenager myself watching this, I was thoroughly creeped out by their relationship and Arya's lack of mental development, leading to the wildly unethical power dynamics between the two of them. I was always rooting for them to break up and was disgusted by the end of the show when they got back together. It was around this time that a whole host of books with questionable relationships were written and put on the New York Times bestseller list. I am certain that no one has forgotten about 50 Shades of Grey and the absurd relationship that was featured in that series. Say whatever you want about the plot and antagonist, but Christian Grey is the main villain of that series, and Anastasia knew it when she left him in the first place. He was controlling, demanding, emotionally constipated, not to mention a stalker, and much older than Anastasia. She, in turn, was a naive college student who was innocent in every way and had to be introduced to his world of bondage and saddle crops. The first book is about Anastasia's sexual awakening and going from being an innocent lamb to the submissive of a volatile man who didn't really know how to take no for an answer.
Stop. No.
A couple of years after that, we had the series and movies 365 Days. I tried to watch this movie at the behest of my sister and could only make it halfway through before I had to stop because of how uncomfortable it made me. For those who have never watched it, read it, or heard of it, count yourselves lucky. Essentially, the apparent love interest, but I'm going to call him a villain because his actions aren't those of any male who is sane, kidnaps the protagonist Laura and says he is going to keep her hostage for an entire year so that she will fall in love with him. If she is not in love with him by the end of 365 days, he'll let her go. As he is a mob boss, I wasn't really inclined to believe him, but that's beside the point. My man was going to engineer Stockholm Syndrome in the hopes of getting the girl. And this storyline not only received an entire book series, but also several movies on Netflix. Because of course, after a certain period of time, Laura abandons all autonomy and falls into the arms of the Italian mafia boss with abandon. It's movies like this that are going to set genuine true feminism back several decades. And this is seen as romantic. This is seen as acceptable. This is seen as desirable. I'm not going to mention any of the hundreds of books that feature manly figures, usually from the occult, as their main love interests, because then we'd be here all day. Just know that they are out there, they exist, and they are rather disgusting. But this trope hasn't just made a home in the romance genre, where it should by all regards be relegated to until the end of time. Instead, it has crept into contemporary television shows, science fiction, and modern fantasy. There are 3 prominent examples that I can think of, and as I have stated earlier, there are many reasons for why these thirst trap created villains are entirely bad news. Let's start with Kylo Ren. Now, I never really saw what other girls saw in a half-naked Adam Driver, but to each their own, I suppose. Rey was certainly impressed, after all. Kathleen Kennedy and crew have been desperately attempting to turn Star Wars into a girl brand for years, and this scene was possibly the penultimate example of their efforts. There are 2 things about this scene that stuck out to me the most, however. He likely would have chosen a time when he felt she was vulnerable, and then appeared as some sort of Adonis confidant to her. Then, when she is obviously uncomfortable and asks him to put some clothes on, he ignores her request and proceeds to invade more and more of her personal space. His appearance was ultimately to distract her, confuse her, and tempt her. And it worked. Kylo spends a great deal of time using this Force connection to talk to Rey about the past, questioning her understanding of history, and in doing so, ensuring that she has him firmly fixed as a redemptive character in her mind. Rey's feelings towards Kylo are the epitome of, I can fix him. Even though he killed his father in front of her quite literally a week ago, kidnapped her and tried to invade her mind, and has killed a lot of the alliance that she has joined. All of this information is thrown out in the face of chiseled pecs and washboard abs. Not only does this make Rey an incredibly shallow character, but a naive one too. Kylo uses his own physicality and projected vulnerability to prey upon her innocence, and she nearly falls for it. Even though the two part at the end of the movie, Rey is seemingly ready to forgive Kylo of all of his crimes in the face of this new Force bond that they share. Kylo Ren represents a seasoned manipulator. He presents himself as a tempting figure to Rey, twists her understanding of history and what she has been told, and then proceeds to use her as a pawn in his own desire for power. He succeeds in making her forget all the evil that he has done with twisted and honeyed words, and convinces her that she doesn't want to kill him and that she can, in fact, save him instead, as the writers have confused redemption and romance. More specifically, Kylo Ren represents an abandonment of traditions. He encourages Rey to abandon old-fashioned ideals of heroism, family, morality, and righteousness, and instead pursue a gray path of power and moral ambiguity. This is one of the ways in which thirst trap villains like this are so dangerous, narratively speaking, because they encourage a departure from the ideals that the heroine once held and tempt her down a different path, one far, far away from the hero's journey. Another example of a thirst trap villain would be Sauron/Hallbrand from the Rings of Power. Though this is just one terrible aspect of a terrible show, it also represents several interesting things. Sauron is a figure of extreme power contained into a very masculine form within the show. He presents himself as a capable figure, both physically and verbally, able to combat a number of Galadriel's belligerent personality quirks. He presents himself as a match for her, step for step, and becomes a confidant of hers before she is ever aware of the fact that he is Sauron, even though it was obvious to the audience who he was from the opening scene. There are several scenes in which Galadriel and Halbrand in disguise are alone, and simply talking about life and her past. As a result of his constant ear to her, Galadriel grows to trust him and confide in him. And all this conversation and fellowship results in the season finale with this scene right here. But what's more interesting about this scene specifically is where it took place. There have been several interactions between Galadriel and Halbrand at this point, several conversations that are quite deep in comparison to this one. He could have taken her to any one of those moments in time which would have been more meaningful to her, but he chose their first meeting for a very specific and sinister reason, and it's because this is where Galadriel is the most vulnerable. She has no friends or allies. The sea prevents her from fighting in the way that she always has. She has no armor and is wearing pretty much a nightgown, so there is nothing to protect her body. She is completely and utterly alone. Galadriel is vulnerable to temptation, to attack. She is vulnerable mentally and still pretty raw from everything she has gone through and given up. She has her convictions, but no proof to back them up. In turn, Halbrand is also at his most vulnerable, which puts him on a similar playing field to Galadriel. He has no armor, is fleeing from a terrible unknown, and is as equal to her as he could possibly be at this point. He chooses this moment because it is where he believes he has the best chance of tempting her to his side. Halbrand presents himself in this raw and rugged form and reminds her of the first time they worked together to solve a problem. He reinforces their ability to work well together and reminds her that even when they didn't know each other all that well, they were still a force to be reckoned with. And then, like Kylo Ren, he tempts her. Not primarily with his physicality like Ren did, but with something that the show version of Galadriel has always wanted: power. Power has become the most tempting drug to many female characters these days, and whether it is being offered to them by the villain character or he himself represents the power, or both, power has taken the place of love. There is so much to unpack in this image. The fact that it places Galadriel and Sauron on the same playing field, a crown on his head, and a billowing dress on her, and her obviously in the role of Lady of Middle-earth beside him. It also lays out the television show's desires of Sauron, which he really shouldn't have. But that's another point altogether. He wants Galadriel for some reason, and this entire scene's inclusion is his sales pitch. Forgetting for a moment that she rejected him, this is why thirst trap villains simply need to go. They truthfully serve no purpose other than to appeal to the baser instincts of the shallow female characters that Hollywood has created to insert themselves into media. And speaking of self-inserts into famous IPs, we have Leslie Headland's Acolyte as a final example. I'm pretty sure at this point that no one has forgotten about Chimere, the Jedi turned Sith who broke the internet for exposing himself to the girl he kidnapped after he killed a bunch of her friends. That should be more than enough said right there. But the reason Chimere is probably the worst of all these thirst trap villains is not just the indecent exposure, not just the incredibly inappropriate language he uses with a girl that he doesn't know.
You're not gonna join me. I'd like to put my clothes back on.
Chimere represents the basest, most carnal temptations that it seems a lot of women have these days. The darkest of dark bad boys who tempts Osha with both power and himself. He tempts her physically, he tempts her emotionally, and he tempts her morally, even though Osha didn't really have all that many morals to begin with. Sex and power seem to be the two most desirable things a person can strive for these days, and Chimere offers both of them to Osha. Not only does this version of a thirst trap villain represent himself in the cringiest way possible, but we have no evidence as to why he has such an interest in Osha in the first place. He is literally there to tempt her to the dark side and nothing else. He's clearly interested in her physically, and so is she, despite having no reason to be attracted to him at all, given everything that he has done. But the problem with Chimere is that he tugs Osha away from logic, away from any sort of common sense, and into an ambiguity that makes no sense at all. The end of the show sees the two of them holding hands while staring off into the horizon, finally free from the Jedi and everyone who has harmed them. And it was then that I began to understand that Chimere represents freedom to those who have written him. But it's not the good kind. It's a freedom from morals, a freedom from restrictions of any kind, a freedom from common sense and logic and any type of structure that might cause a person to grow and become better than they were. This version of the thirst trap villain offers freedom without consequences, and this is why the thirst trap villain is such a bad narrative trope. Villainous characters obsessed with main females will continue, but I am concerned that we are going to see more and more of these thirst trap villains as time goes on because of the cheap, shallow, easy way they are to write. They are essentially junk food to the average woman, and in order to get stories, meaningful stories, back to the forefront of Hollywood where they should be, thirst trap villains need to go the way of the dodo bird. Because ultimate freedom, like ultimate power, corrupts. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. If you know of any other examples of thirst trap villains that you want to bring to my attention, please leave them in the comments down below and let the conversations begin. Until next time, everyone.